afternoon, evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm George Moss again here at allpointstv.com and also WFOV 92.1. And we're very glad to have both audiences with us this afternoon on Memorial Day. And we are coming together. Hopefully you're there on your Memorial Day and you are memorializing the ones that had meaning in your life. And of course, the special occasion is for those that were ones involved in the ultimate sacrifice on behalf of this country in the armed services. This day was, I think, first of all, I think we can go back and trace the day to 1868 in the aftermath of the so-called Civil War that saw, 620,000, I think, would be the latest count of how many persons died on both sides of what is called the Civil War in this country that was fought between 1861 and 1865. And in a needless war, and most of these wars that are fought on the planet are needless wars, and that's another reason why we need to look at our electing people to these positions of power in the political arena, because some of the things that they're doing, and then the solemn position they're placed in, that place people in harm's way, we must make sure we have the best that we have to offer those that are standing above the moral gap left in this country by the present-day politicians, for example, and all the ones we've had in the past as well, that have gotten us involved in these wars where people are asked to sacrifice themselves on behalf of the country, which nobody should object to, that being the objective of if that's the objective of war. But a lot of times it's for other reasons why wars are being fought. And to have these politicians asking people to make that sacrifice and they don't have the best interests of those persons in the armed service at heart, as can be seen by the fact we don't take care of them once they arrive back from the battlefield injured, both physically and psychologically, and we don't have the best care for them once they return. But I want to pay special homage to those persons that have done the things that this country is asking them to do, rightly or wrongly engaged in these foreign wars, and also the war that was fought here on American soil. We must pay respects to them because these persons have paid the ultimate price asked of them by their country, and to memorialize them is the right thing to do. And we are doing some things in our household to pay homage, of course, to the fallen soldiers. And I want to show tremendous respect in the national cemeteries of this nation where those persons are buried. I'm going to read something a little bit different than what maybe is being talked about today. I'm going to read something about the Confederate soldiers. And I want to read something about them in terms of what blacks at the time when this memorialization began, what blacks in the southern states, one person in particular, said about the monuments being put up in the name of those that fought on the side of the Confederacy in the war mislabeled as a war for a civil war. They say it's a war fought for the maintenance of slavery, which is as ridiculous as anything can get in terms of the falsification of what this war was really about. This was another war of independence. And it took 4 years to put down this insurrection. You're talking about an insurrection in this country that was a slave insurrection. This was the whole South rising up against the enslavement of the 11 southern states that objected and went out of the Union because of the impropriety of the taxation policies of this country. And if that story were told, I don't think you'd be out there tearing down these monuments to those that showed tremendous valor on another side of the argument that had been raised a number of times in this country, going back to Massachusetts really in 1807 when they raised an objection to what Thomas Jefferson had done in terms of adding to the territorial boundaries of this nation and with the Louisiana Purchase that had been acquired in 1803 from France. There's a lot of things we could talk about as far as that's concerned. But after that acquisition was made, Massachusetts raised the question of secession from the Union, since the character of the Union and the territorial boundaries of the Union were being changed so dramatically, we didn't know exactly how they would play out in terms of the regional interests, since the Louisiana Purchase would have been 9 additional states being added to the 13 states that had been there at the time of the founding of this nation. So they were talking about secession even at that point, and nobody was talking about it being over slavery at that time. And when they began to raise other objections in other parts of the country, such as the regional objection being raised by the South as far as the tariffs were concerned in the 1820s, nobody was saying that the objection had anything to do with slavery in that case either. It was another taxation objection that had been raised in the third, fourth decade in the aftermath of the signing of the Constitution of the United States. I would say this too on the QTN running, that if they had taken the person that was one of the premier thinkers at the Constitution Convention, if they had taken George Mason's way of looking at the prescriptions found in the Constitution, if they had taken his particular analysis of what ought to happen as far as the commerce was concerned, well, George Mason had argued that as far as commerce is concerned, they should have a supermajority in order to, in fact, have a commercial policy prevail in the United States. I think if they had done that, rather than having a majority where the majority can just simply through a majoritarian verdict can outvote those that are in the minority, and if by doing that you can then have the majority oppressing the minority. What George Mason had argued at the Constitution Convention is that you ought to have, as far as commerce is concerned, you ought to have a supermajority that's required, and that would in fact have to involve those that are in the minority voice in order for the issue to prevail. It would have to involve some members in the minority group, and by not doing that, they set up the conditions that would eventually lead to the outbreak of the war that came about in April of 1861, when the South simply did what they've been threatening to do for the last 40 years, starting in 1824, when they were threatening to leave the Union over what they called these tariffs of abomination, starting with the tariff of 1824, and then the tariff of 1828 and the tariff of 1832. Each of them considered by the South to be a tariff of abomination, and also to be in violation of Article 1, Section 8, Article 1, Section 9, which would be clauses 4, 5, and 6. If you go back and read that, you'll see that the disproportionality of the taxation policies was in fact denied. They did not have the right to tax disproportionately in the country. And this enumeration of taxation was going on through these tariffs being a backdoor tax, where you're taxing goods coming into the country and you're paying the tax at the cash register. You're not paying it directly into the coffers of the government, but the taxation does go into the coffers of the government because it is a tax based on imports, and then the import tax goes into the federal treasury, and then the cost of that taxation is passed on to the American people in terms of the cost of the goods. And so by buying the goods, you're paying the tax, that's a tariff, and it's passed on through the government around to the American people. And the South is objecting to the fact that these taxes are, in fact, being disproportionately applied to the South. That's an export part of the country. And by them having to pay a tax, therefore, placed on imports for exporting countries in Europe, the tax is then circular, and the South is paying a tax in terms of their goods being exported out of the country, and they're paying an import tax into those countries. And that tax they're paying is the one they're using to pay the import tax here, but export tax from their country, but they're paying a tax of their goods coming into this country. So really the South is therefore, through a circular way, the South is actually paying the tax burden that benefits the North, and that's where they're objecting to it. And for these persons to have this notion that they're objecting to the North trying to get rid of their slaves, I just want to tell you that you can run that by people that have not studied the record, but I studied the record, and all of those persons out there, professors included at these universities, are in fact misinforming the students who are out here now teaching that nonsense. This is not a tax. This is not a war over slavery. This is a second revolt against taxation in this country that is not peculiar to what they were doing in 1776. Take my word for it, but go and check behind me as well, because I don't ask anybody to take my word for anything. Everything I'm telling you can be documented if a person would just put the time in and do the documentation. Okay, so we got this day that we want to celebrate, but we want to be clear about the nature of the celebration and what we ought to be celebrating on this day. We should be celebrating all of those who, through their valor, died on the battlefields or died in the military service of this country, and that is as much a issue for those that fought on the side of the Confederacy as they fought on the other states. I'm here to tell you that tearing down those statues is inappropriate. If you understand the history of this country, that would not be done. These persons were patriots. And I know people are not going to accept that because you don't know anything other than what you've been taught in these incarceration camps, these indoctrination centers. And they've taught that the South, the 11 states, were fighting against slavery. The 11 states were fighting on behalf of slavery, fighting to keep their slaves. And the other states, the 22 other states that were at that time in the Union, were fighting to rid the South of its slaves. And therefore, this war was over the slave situation that was prevailing in this country at that time. The problem with that narrative is that they had slaves in the northern states as well. In the Union states, they had slave states on the side of the Union, and therefore to sustain that argument, you can't sustain it. Because if it's over slavery, then why do you have slaves in the Union states? And also, when the Emancipation Proclamation is issued by Abraham Lincoln, why did it not apply to the states that were in the Union that had slaves? It only applied to those states that had succeeded, or at least attempted to succeed, which was a constitutional, which they were allowed to do based upon the founding of the country in terms of the sovereignty that those states had to found the nation itself. And they surrendered some of the sovereignty only to create the Union, but they maintained the sovereignty in terms of the secession aspect of it, which is the ultimate control they had over federal government going out of control. Anyway, I'm just laying a foundation of what I want to read here about those that were, where they were setting up a statue to Stonewall Jackson. Somebody should read about Stonewall Jackson, one of the Confederate soldiers. This is there's a discussion going on about whether or not to build a statue to Stonewall Jackson, and they're arguing on both sides of the divide. And these blacks are taking the position that monument to Stonewall Jackson should be built. So here's what I want to read about that. 50 miles below Lexington, Virginia, home of Stonewall Jackson, the Roanoke Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church still displays a unique stained glass window. It depicts a peaceful scene with a river running through a field and a woods beyond. There is a line of tents in the field with arms stacked in front, and an inscription beneath, which reads, "In memory of Stonewall Jackson," followed by his famous last words, quote, "Let us cross over the river and rest in the shade of the trees." The window was installed some 40 years after Jackson's death by the Reverend L.L. Downing, D.D., Dr. Divinity, originally of Lexington. It has survived lightning strokes and flames. The Reverend Downing and his congregation were Negroes. There is also a bronze statue of Jackson over his grave in the Lexington Cemetery, paid for by popular subscription. The first contribution was made by the Negro Baptist Church there, whose pastor had been a member of the Sunday school class that Jackson had organized and financed. Stonewall Jackson had organized the Sunday school class and financed it. In Mississippi, on February 11, 1890, an appropriation for a monument to the Confederate dead was being considered. A delegate had just spoken against the bill when John F. Harris, Negro Republican delegate from Washington County, rose to speak. And this is what he said. Mr. Speaker, I have arisen here in my place to offer a few words on the bill. I have come from a sick bed. Perhaps it was not prudent for me to come. But, sir, I could not rest quietly in my room without contributing a few remarks of my own. I was sorry to hear the speech of the young gentleman from Marshall County. I am sorry that any son of a soldier should go on record as opposed to the erection of a monument in honor of the brave dead. And, sir, I am convinced that had he seen what I saw at Seven Pines and in the 7 days fighting around Richmond, the battlefield covered with the mangled forms of those who fought for their country. He's talking about fighting for the South that has succeeded. So he says, for those who fought for their country and for their country's honor, he would not have made that speech. When the news came, I'm still quoting from this speech. When the news came that the South had been invaded, the South being invaded by the Northern soldiers, when the news came that the South had been invaded, those men went forth to fight for what they believed, and they made no request for monuments. But they died, and their virtues should be remembered. Sir, this is a black person talking now. Sir, I went with them. I too wore the gray, the same color my master wore. We stayed 4 long years. And if that war had gone on till now, I would have been there yet. I want to honor those brave men who died for their convictions. When my mother died, I was a boy. Who, sir, then acted the part of a mother to the orphan slave boy but my old missus? Were she living now, or could speak to me from those high realms where are gathered the sainted dead, she would tell me to vote for this bill. And, sir, I shall vote for it. I want it known to all the world that my vote is given in favor of the bill to erect a monument in honor of the Confederate dead. Unquote. When the applause died down, the measure passed overwhelmingly, and every Negro member voted A. When you go out there and tear those monuments down, I want you to know how those blacks who lived during that time felt about it. And they're not the ones who are brainwashed. The ones that are brainwashed, the ones out there doing the destruction of those monuments. So I'm here to celebrate Memorial Day, but I'm here to celebrate it with the total information of what this day stands for and should stand for.
You know, I'd like to know this. Of Europe has experienced bloodshed after bloodshed, over any conceivable reason why a human can kill another human for. Some make sense, some are really stretched to make sense out of that. And I just don't see in Europeans, and I'm not one to usually say in Europe they do this, I'm not that, but I just don't see the animosity and the vitriol that they have of it over there towards one another. They don't want to join. A lot of it's resistance against the European Union and the effects of that. But you just don't see like this, you don't see this blame shifting or blame point and finger pointing at each other. as you do here in this country.
Right.
So, because I think it's maybe because of the sheer number of things that the Europeans killed each other over. Because let's face it was religion. It was because you backed this other side. I think England went through 11 or 12 civil wars. So and I guess some people do have, they met their ancestors were on this side or that side, and that's a source of either honor or dishonor them. But I just don't see like the expectation of a current generation to hold to either carry the water or to hate themselves for something that happened hundreds of years ago, and I just think it's bizarre in this country.
Yeah, John, you're making a point that we need to talk about. The reason why. Let me say this first. Let me bring Thomas Paine in, then I want to respond to what you said. Thomas Paine said that government at best is a necessary evil, and in its worst state, let me get his words exactly here. In his worst state, he didn't use these words. The word he used was different, but he's talking about. But in his worst state, it is I know what he said. It's an intolerable one. It's intolerable. So, reason I say that in response to what John just said is that in Europe they don't have the government figures in Europe they have here. The reason why they keep waving the bloody shirt in this country is because this country is being divided by these politicians. That's what they intend to do, and that's what they've been doing. The reason why they keep beating down on the South, they're the ones who led all they were doing in Charlottesville. The reason why Charlottesville is so important in terms of the so-called Civil War is because Charlottesville was where the Union had its greatest victory in this war. And by having that victory in Charlottesville, Virginia, they then took the war to Pennsylvania. That's why they have the Gettysburg battles going on between July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. And that war, they took that war into Pennsylvania so as to try to get Europe to recognize the South in their independence movement, because they needed Europe in order to sustain. If Europe would have stopped its trade with the North, it would have strengthened the South's hand in that war, and they were trying to show legitimacy. They had a chance to win the independence war, and that's why they went into Pennsylvania to continue what they had done, what had happened in Charlottesville. They were taking their victory, and since the Union Army was running out of Charlottesville, they were chasing them into that place, not to invade the North, but to, in fact, make a statement of the South can come out on top of this war, and therefore recognition ought to be given right now in terms of recognizing the South diplomatically. That's why when I say that every battle in the war between 1861 and 1865, every war to end the secession in this country was fought in the southern states. And then people write and say, well, what about the Gettysburg War? You need to do your homework. That war was not won in order. The question I would raise there is how are you going to bring the South back into the Union by fighting battles that's not in the South? How are you going to bring them back into the Union fighting a war in Pennsylvania? That's not what's going on here. What's going on there is the South, Lee's army was chasing the Union and trying to bring about a conclusive victory to end this invasion in the southern states. And I stand by what I said, the Northern historian is saying, I stand by what I said. Every battle that was fought to bring the South back into the Union at the point of the bayonet was fought in the southern states, basically fought in Virginia. And somebody should read the book called Why the South Lost the War. And that's a whole different conversation too, outside of what I want to cover today. But I wanted to read that because when we study the history and we understand the real history of this country, this day is very important. And you want to heal this nation, then let's heal it by having all of the person that died in defense of this country. That includes the Confederate States that fought this war to, in fact, defend the South against the economic imperialism of the Union States, which were the Northern states at that point. But at the time of the war, of course, it'd be the Union States fighting the ones that had seceded. This war is not about slavery. This war is about taxation, and it's in the same image of the war we fought in terms of the independence in 1776, but defined differently because of the cover-up that's taking place. Okay, that's why I read that, and I want us to understand this as we are celebrating, rightly so, those who martyred themselves for this country, and those persons that fought in the South did the same thing. Okay, we're coming up on a break here, and I will go to some other topics, but when you come back, we won't be very far away from where you were when you took your break at WFOV, and we're always very glad when you come back. Okay, that's one of the topics I wanted to cover, but I wanted to also go into some things I've been promising for the last couple of weeks, and we have not gotten around to it, so I don't want to go too far into the program before I get around to looking at some of the other issues that need to be cleaned up based on our prior conversations. Let me read something to you by a professor from Harvard University, and don't get intimidated by these persons being professors at Harvard University and these other universities. They want you to be intimidated when you hear that this is a professor, Harvard University professor so-and-so, and you're supposed to be intimidated thinking that because they are from these elite, I'll say elite, but I don't really mean that in the sense they are the same universities now they were in the past. But the so-called elite universities, and when they quote them as having said something, that's supposed to be information coming from the mountaintop. And I want to show you, if I can, that that is not necessarily so. Lawrence Trabb, if you go back to the debates that were going on during the election of 2016, you'll find that as the primaries were being held, getting ready to be held in Iowa, the question of Ted Cruz's citizenship came up, raised by Donald Trump. And it was raised by Donald Trump because he was saying that we need to have clarity of whether or not Ted Cruz is eligible to be president of the United States because he was not born on the soil of the United States, and whether or not he can actually run for the presidency because of the question mark about whether someone outside the country who is not born in the United States, is that person eligible to run for president? And Donald Trump was saying that that ought to be cleared up in case he becomes a nominee. And then if he's a nominee of the party, the Democrats could raise it and then make him ineligible. And then, of course, the candidate loses and the party loses. So that question needs to be cleared up right now before the election, the primary elections are over. And so in that discussion, Donald Trump mentioned the name of Harvard professor Lawrence Trabb. So I want to read you some comments made by Lawrence Trabb, and then we're going to talk about it from the standpoint of someone who's not a Harvard professor, named Alan Cohen, a person that has written a number of books on gun rights in the country, and not a professor, but a freelance writer. And I want to read what he says after reading what Lawrence Trabb said about this whole issue of the eligibility for president. I'll put the words on the screen later on, but I want to read what was said here by Lawrence Trabb. Now, don't forget, Lawrence Trabb is a professor at Harvard University, still teaching law at Harvard University. As the 2016 election season ramps up, this article is written, by the way, January 21st, 2016. So we haven't had the election yet. The election, as you recall, would have been held in November. As the 2016 election season ramps up, Harvard law professor Lawrence Trabb, 62, finds himself at the center of a political firestorm. Okay, glad to have you back in WFOV. And we are now getting into another part of our conversation today on Memorial Day, and that is about the comments made about eligibility to be president of the United States. And I was saying here that Lawrence Tribe is being called upon to answer the question of whether or not Ted Cruz in the election 2016 was eligible to run for president because he was born in Canada, therefore born outside of the United States. And so I'm reading an article that talked about that, and they're going to quote the conversation. In their conversation, they're going to quote Lawrence Tribe's comments, since he's the one that was called upon to satisfy the question in 2016 whether or not Ted Cruz was eligible to run for president. Let me go back over what I read right before you came back. As the 2016 election season ramps up, Harvard law professor Lawrence Tribe, the class of 62, finds himself at the center of a political firestorm. Over the past month, Republican presidential hopeful and law school graduate Ted Cruz denounced his former constitutional law professor Tribe as, quote, a left-wing judicial activist, while speaking in a mid-January Republican debate, while rival candidate Donald Trump has tweeted and debated in support of Tribe. Donald Trump is quoting Tribe as he begins to raise the question about Ted Cruz's eligibility. The focus on Tribe stemmed from a widely cited op-ed he penned in the Boston Globe earlier this month titled, quote, under Ted Cruz's own logic, he is ineligible for the White House. In the article, Tribe calls into question Cruz's consistency in interpreting the Constitution. Cruz, a known originalist, the word originalist in quotation marks, who interprets the Constitution based on the intent of its framers, was born in Canada to an American mother and a Cuban father. Tribe wrote that originalists would argue the Constitution's framers likely intended natural-born, a constitutional prerequisite for becoming U.S. president, to mean physically born in the United States. By these standards, he continued, Cruz should be ineligible to hold the nation's highest office. The op-ed brought Tribe to national attention as Cruz and Trump briefly sparred during a televised Republican debate, arguing about Tribe's position and motivation for writing the op-ed. Before the debate, Cruz's campaign published a memo attacking Tribe, who was Cruz's former professor. And I might also add that Tribe also taught Roberts, the President Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and he also taught Barack Obama. Tribe insists that his motivations were not political. In other words, writing what he wrote wasn't political. He's not writing it because Ted Cruz is running in the Republican Party and he's a Democrat. So he's saying that Tribe insists that his motivations were not political, despite airing his liberal views openly. Tribe has not endorsed a candidate. Furthermore, he maintains that according to his own, quote, living constitutionalist method of interpretation, or more flexible reading of the Constitution, Cruz should be, listen to this now, a more flexible reading of the Constitution, which is being advocated by Tribe, Cruz should be able to run for the presidency. Look at these contradictions. Look at these contradictions. Let me go back and read something over. This man is so confused. Let's see. Over the past month, I'm reading back over what I read. I want to stop and pause to make sure you understand what Tribe is saying here. And this man is a constitutional scholar at Harvard University. Over the past month, Republican presidential hopeful and law school graduate Ted Cruz denounced his former constitutional law professor Tribe as a left-wing judicial activist while speaking in a mid-January Republican debate, the one with Trump and the others running in the Republican primary, while rival candidate Donald Trump has tweeted and debated in support of tribe. The focus on tribe stemmed from a widely cited op-ed he penned in the Boston Globe earlier this month, titled listen to this title now, titled Under Ted Cruz's Own Logic, He's Ineligible for the White House. Mr. Tribe, the eligibility of Ted Cruz is not determined by whether or not he has written an article. It's based upon whether or not he's eligible to run, based upon whether or not the Constitution allows it. So regardless as to the opinion that Ted Cruz has, the question is whether or not that is sanctioned by the language in the Constitution. Now, you're a constitutional scholar, but you make this outrageous statement here. The focus on tribes stemmed from a widely cited op-ed he penned in the Boston Globe earlier this month, titled Under Ted Cruz's Own Logic, He's Ineligible for the White House. He's not ineligible for the White House because of his own logic. He's ineligible or eligible by whether or not the Constitution allows him to run based upon what it means for a person to run for the presidency. That's found in Article 2, Section 1, Clause 5, which I'll put on the screen in just a minute. So that's problem number one with the article. Cruz, a known originalist. In other words, Cruz has said that he believes that we ought to interpret the Constitution based upon the original intent. What did the framers mean by natural born? So then he says that Cruz, a known originalist, who interprets the Constitution based on the intent of the framers, was born in Canada to an American mother and a Cuban father. Tribe wrote that originalists would argue the Constitution framers likely intended, he says, natural born, a constitutional prerequisite for becoming U.S. president. He's saying here they likely intended that to mean physically born in the United States. Likely now, he uses likely intended. You know what this shows me? This shows me what I've been saying about these people. I've been saying that they're not literate. And that's why I suspect they always go to tell us what the court said. You see, I don't care what the court said. The court is not the foundation upon the laws of this land. It's not 9 people. The foundation of the law of this land is the Constitution. And as I read this offensive language, this is very offensive. He says it's the likely intent. I'm going to show you later that you can't use that. You cannot say that and be a scholar. Because likely would mean that the intent is in question. And I'm going to show you it's not in question. But this scholar from Harvard University is illiterate. And I said last week, I don't mean illiterate the same way that you might claim that the fighter that was being interviewed after the fight was over, that was splitting verbs. I don't mean illiterate in the same way in which that illiteracy was expressed in that interview. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about being able to read clear language and understand its import. And by him saying the likely intent, Trabb wrote that originalists would argue the Constitution's framers would argue the Constitution's framers likely intended natural born to mean physically born in the United States. That's not the likely intent, that is the intent. And if you say likely, then you're saying by using the word likely, you're saying that it's not specifically expressed, and the implication, therefore, can be gleaned by some that would say it means this and some that would say it means something different. Wherein, if you read the language there cannot be any likelihood of it meaning something different. It says what it says, and it says it in the way that it says it, that if you can read it, you know the specificity of it. And Lawrence Trabb does not understand the specificity of it. Therefore, he's talking about the likely intent of it. It's not likely intent. The intent is specifically expressed in it. I'll get to that later. I will get to it. The op-ed brought Trabb national attention as Cruz and Trump briefly sparred during a televised Republican debate, arguing about Trabb's position and motivations for writing the op-ed. Before the debate, Cruz's campaign published a memo attacking Trabb, Cruz's former professor. He calls him a left-wing activist, which that part is true. Trabb insists that his motivations were not political. In other words, he is making specific reference to the question that he raises. The question not raised by the Constitution is raised by him and others like him, of whether or not he can run based upon the requirement of natural born in the Constitution. Does he meet the test? Now, Trabb, who claims that he might not be eligible, but he wants to act as if he's not acting political here, because he is a constitutional scholar. Yeah, listen to this part of what was stated here. Trabb insists that his motivations were not political. Despite airing his liberal views openly, Trabb has not endorsed a candidate. Furthermore, he maintains that according to his own, listen to this part here now, to his own, quote, living constitutionalist method of interpretation, Trabb sees the Constitution as a living document. That is, the original intent can be dismissed by those that come in the aftermath of it, putting meaning on it that's not intended by those who wrote it. This is a constitutional scholar advocating this. He is one that's for a living constitution, a living document, as opposed to a document that has original intent. In other words, the document can lend itself to whatever the times say that it means based upon new interpretations of it. So we can now apply natural born to that which was not intended. You know something, I get so angry when I read these people like Lawrence Trabb, who is not a scholar of the Constitution. In fact, Lawrence Trabb, who says that he's not acting politically, Lawrence Trabb, your latest book is titled this. This is your latest book. And it's also nonsense. The title of his book, the latest one he wrote it in May of 2018, is titled "To End a Presidency, the Power of Impeachment." Folks, I have to tell you something. You cannot even write a book that's titled that way and be a scholar. You see, you've had impeachment of two presidents, Andrew Johnson in 1867, 1868. It failed by one vote to bring about conviction. And you had charges brought against Bill Clinton, and that also failed to be sustained by a 2/3 vote in the Senate. And so this title here is problematical. To end a presidency, the power of impeachment. You see, I see something in this that if you read it, you probably would not see in it. This is the hope. Because there's been no power of impeachment to end a presidency. No presidency has been ended through the impeachment process. To end a presidency, the power of impeachment. Tribe is doing the same thing, during the same time as Mueller is doing his investigation. And that's what you saw Mueller doing. Mueller opened up the possibility, without making the claim, that there was obstruction of justice. And the reason why he left the question open, he wanted that to be used as a way of driving the president out of office through the impeachment process. And that's what Tribe is doing, this dishonest man. This man is dishonest. He's not a constitutional scholar. He's one of those activists in the classroom indoctrinating students that's coming out here, and they are coming from Harvard University, so therefore they'll be at the top of the game in how society is run by these people who are being put out here in the political landscape. Roberts being one of his students, Obama being one of his students, Ted Cruz being one of his students. And this is why this man is so dangerous. He poses as a constitutional scholar, but no constitutional scholar will do what he did and making these statements. Let me read to you somebody who's not a constitutional scholar, but a freelance writer. And I'm going to read this from Alan Corwin and let you hear what he has to say about it, coming behind the scholar from Harvard who claims that it's not clear. Let me read what he says. This is Alan Corwin, who has written 6 books and co-authored 8 other books. But he's not at Harvard University, so you may not want to give him the same credit you give to the Harvard scholar. But let me read him anyway and see if it compares with what this man said. It says here, let me read, shall I start at the very beginning? Do I need to read that in order to bring clarity, or can I just start somewhere to save time? Okay, let me start here. The idea that a court must weigh in because the founders didn't define the term in the Constitution is nonsense. Listen to that again. The idea that a court must weigh in because the founders didn't define the term. What is the term he's talking about? The term natural born. The idea that a court must weigh in because the founders didn't define the term in the Constitution is nonsense. He says the likely meaning, the scholar. The non-scholar says that the idea that a court must weigh in because the founders didn't define the term in the Constitution is nonsense. He's saying it is defined in the Constitution. It's the same type of nonsense. I'm still reading now from the non-scholar. It's the same type of nonsense modern people have created to undermine other fundamental elements of our Constitution. The founders knew exactly what the term meant, just like they knew what, quote, weights and measures meant when they used that term without defining it. And they used it with precision for deliberate reason. I'm still reading now what this non-scholar stated, the freelance writer stated, not the scholar from Harvard University. The non-scholar says, continuing his statement, the presidency is the only office in our entire legal structure that has this requirement, meaning natural born, as a requirement for office. The presidency is the only office in our entire legal structure that has this requirement. Citizen appears throughout the law. Natural born citizen appears in one place only, as a requirement for the highest office in the land. You can stop here and you have the truth of the matter, or read further if this interests you and you want the details. He goes on to give the details, but he's already said enough by saying that the language in Article 2, Section 1, Clause 5 defines natural born citizen. And he says here, to say that it is not clear, the idea that the court must weigh in because the founders didn't define the term in the Constitution is nonsense. In other words, there is no doubt about what they meant by it. It may be some doubt in Lawrence Tribe's mind, but that just shows you that Lawrence Tribe is illiterate. I don't care if he has a PhD degree. And all of you that get starstruck about degrees, let me tell you this. All the ones in the university they're quoting that had great minds didn't have a degree. Aristotle didn't have a degree. And Plato didn't have a degree. And for your religiousness, Jesus didn't have a degree. So all of you that are infatuated with degrees, I have 3 degrees. Don't get me wrong about that. I'm not disparaging degrees if you earned it. But if you can't read and you have a degree, that's a problem.
The thing is, you got to read carefully. The thing is, you could read through something and you could read every word in there, but if it's not sinking in what it's saying, then you're just as bad as being illiterate, because you're letting it go through. Like it says that in the Bible too. It says about, people who basically hear the word and not doers, or basically read the wording, which is, I mean, it's a legal document. If Tribe is being a trainer of people who are going to be lawyers, contractual law depends on reading and understanding what's intended by that wording.
Right.
Okay, so he's a horrible teacher for people who are going to become lawyers.
Yeah, he's training people. Johnny. They say Johnny can't read. Well, Johnny is teaching the class now. Johnny is Lawrence Tribe. I don't mean they can't pronounce the words, but you'd be surprised at how many times these scholars want to tell us what the court said. That tells me that they can't read understanding, because they want the court to tell them what it says. I don't have to tell the court. I don't have to have the court tell me what it says. I can read it for myself. Let me put on the screen that which Lawrence Tribe cannot read, so we can read it together. I asked John to index this, Article 2, Section 1, Clause 5. I'll read it out. I'll show you the Constitution. I'll read from it to make sure you think that, so you'll know that it comes out of this document. This is not something you have to make up. So let me go to Article 2, Section 1, Clause 5 in the Constitution. You got it on the screen there. So let me read. This is Article 2 of the Constitution. Let me go to Section 1 of the Article 5, and I'm going to go down 5 clauses there. And it reads this way. And Tribe says that it likely means something. That's not what the non-scholar said. And I agree with the non-scholar. Well, when I say non-scholar, he is a scholar in another domain. He doesn't claim to be a constitutional scholar. That's what Lawrence Tribe claims. But the non-constitutional scholar says that the idea that there's not specificity in the language in Article 2, Section 1, Clause 5, he says that's nonsense. And I'm going to show that he's right and Lawrence Tribe is wrong. Two persons cannot be right about the same thing with opposite points of view. So here's the language in Article 2, Section 1, Clause 5. It says, no person except a natural-born citizen or a citizen of the United States at the time of the adoption of this Constitution shall be eligible to the office of the president. Neither shall any person be eligible to that office who shall not have obtained to the age of 35 years and been 14 years a resident within the United States. Alan Corwin says that language is very clear about eligibility and what's meant by natural-born citizen. And the reason why he's right and Trabb is wrong is because Corwin understands what the language is saying, and also he understands the location of the language. That's what I wanted to teach 2 weeks ago when I wanted to teach how to read the document. And I said this last week when we had a special guest in the studio on a special program that we did with a person that I have tremendous respect for. We don't necessarily agree, but I have a lot of respect for Jonathan Ettinger. He's an honest person, and I consider him to be a scholar. I said he was intellectual. I don't want to say intellectual because there are no intellectuals in this country today. I agree with Ayn Rand. We had the first intellectuals and the last intellectuals with the founders of this country, and they don't exist. We do have scholars. Jonathan Ettinger is a scholar. We don't have to agree for me to agree. He has a scholarly acumen in what he says. This man has read something. He's understood some things he's read. And we don't have to agree on what we were talking about this past Saturday. That's not the point. The point is, does he have a body of information that he understands? And he understands a lot better than these persons that call themselves scholars in these universities. Now let's look at Article 2, Section 1, Clause 5. And let's understand what's being said here. Article 2, Section 1, Clause 5 says, and I'll stop this time and I'll show you where the definition of natural born is found. No person except a natural born citizen or a citizen of the United States at the time of the adoption of the Constitution shall be eligible to the office of the president. The definition of the term natural born is found in the location of the addendum to the requirement. No person shall accept a natural born citizen, but it makes an exception to natural born citizen by the next statement, or a citizen of the United States at the time of the adoption of the document. Why does it make an exception? Because the natural birth citizenship that's being claimed in the document cannot be sustained by anybody in the country at that time. You see, the specificity is found in the location. And that's why I was saying 2 weeks ago, and I didn't say this part, but location is everything. The exemption to the requirement is found next to it. And the exemption is next to it because nobody fits that requirement at that time. Because nobody is born in the United States at that time, because the United States did not exist before 1776. And that's why he reads it clearly, Alan Corwin, and he doesn't understand it. Talking about Lawrence Trabb. Location is everything, folks. And when you understand the importance of the location of the language, you can read it clearly. And Lawrence Trabb, you need to go back and read it yourself, and this time understand it. Okay, I got to get out of here. I didn't cover everything I wanted to cover again, but I will cover it as we continue these conversations. Until next week, I want you to follow your dream, because if you don't follow your dream, you'll never know what's on the other side of the rainbow.